Hi, everyone. Welcome. We'll be starting in just a moment. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm going to wait just a couple more minutes. People are joining us. Thank you for coming to today's discussion. We're very glad to have you with us. We'll be starting in just a moment. Thanks for joining. We're going to wait just a little bit more. We've got still some people coming in. So hang on and we'll be starting shortly. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll be starting in just a moment. So welcome, welcome, wherever you're joining us from. We'll be starting in just a moment. Great. The tech is working. We're on multiple channels. So that's really good to hear. We'll be starting. Just gonna give another 30 seconds and then we'll get underway. Great. Well, thank you, everyone. I'd like to wish you a very warm welcome this evening, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you're joining from. On behalf of the John Humphrey Centre for Peace and Human Rights, She Associates, and the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar. Hear the Women Experiences from Women Human Rights Defenders on the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. My name is Beth Waranyuk, and I am the chair. I have the honor to chair the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada. First tonight, I'd like to point out that I'm joining you from the traditional, unsurrendered, unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people. Acknowledging that the Algonquin Anishinaabeg people have walked and stewarded this land since time immemorial is an important piece of our reconciliation journey. It's also important for our discussion today as Indigenous women, human rights defenders in Canada and around the world are doing such brave work. And it's important that we listen and hear their voices and act on their recommendations. The purpose of today's event is to provide a platform for women human rights defenders to showcase their work, discuss best practices and challenges that they encounter, and hear about their perspectives on the state of affairs in relation to human rights today. We welcome all of you joining in. It's an opportunity to listen, to learn, to join in the discussion, to be challenged, and to figure out how we can support women human rights defenders as the Canadian government, as individuals, as organizations, how we can support them in their home countries, how we can support them in third countries, and how we can support them in temporary homes or maybe permanent homes like here in Canada. This event is part of the Ignite Change Global Convention for the 75th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights. There are other events planned as part of this convention through the 10th of December. Please check out the website for more information. And I think that's going to be posted in the chat. So stay tuned and you can see that. And I encourage you to visit. There's lots of great things going on. On the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada, we bring together organizations and individuals working on the full range of women, peace and security issues, including women human rights defenders, disarmament, women's participation in peace processes, LGBTQ issues in peace and security issues, how various crises are colliding in today's world, and many, many more. Our main purpose is to monitor the Canadian government's implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We also support building capacities on women, peace and security issues across Canada. We're very pleased to have a number of women human rights defenders as part of our network. It's important to note that we are living in a very difficult moment. Violence, militarism, violations of international law, repression happen all too often in the homes of our speakers, plus Gaza, Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, and so many more. There are very strong emotions, and in our webinar today, we ask for respectful conduct. We will remove people who do not behave respectfully. Before heading to the discussion, I would like to acknowledge that today is December 6th, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. We mark the 34th anniversary of the Montreal Massacre, when a shooter murdered 14 women at the École Polytechnique just because they were women. All these years later, violence against women continues. Last year alone, there were 30 femicides in 30 weeks in Ontario alone. Actions to address the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls are all too slow, and violence against LGBTQI people is increasing. So I'd like to turn now to introduce you to the host of today's panel, the moderator. I'd like to turn it over to Urooj. Urooj Mian is the CEO of a boutique consulting firm called Sustainable Human Empowerment, She Associates. And she's the chair of the Women, Peace and Security Network Canada's Anti-Racism Committee. She has a background in peace and conflict research and international criminal law and justice. She works regularly with women human rights defenders here in Canada and abroad. And I must say, I'm always inspired by Urooj's strategic sense and dedication. And so Urooj, over to you to introduce our speakers and to moderate today's discussion. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it, Beth. So I will start with a few statements and we'll jump right into discussion. I believe that it is important to distinguish and speak to the celebration of what it means when we commemorate anniversaries of key events and tools in the world of human rights and policies, such as the Women, Peace and Security Agenda. These occasions are important as they provide us opportunity to reflect, have dialogue, and work together for the betterment of the tools themselves, the systems, and our causes. We advertised that this would be a critical discussion and a learning opportunity by showcasing the work of our expert and internationally renowned speakers. And so we will encourage this as the tone of the event. What does this mean? It means we are not necessarily celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Human Rights Declaration, which arguably continues to be applied selectively for some and not for others. We are offering reflections on it and its related work, utility, importance, and betterment. I will be remiss to also not mention my immediate thought process when earlier this year there was recognition that this was the 75th anniversary of the Declaration. Months ago, and more so in recent weeks, my immediate thought process went to also recognizing that this year marks the 75th anniversary of the mass vicious displacement of Palestinians in 1948 from their homeland and the ongoing illegal occupation that we see today. As we discuss our work in defending human rights today, know that our movements are in solidarity with each other when practiced genuinely. And this is why you see millions and billions of people rising against human rights violations, fueled by greed, colonialism, and racist hierarchies. As we speak today, we acknowledge that there are multiple tests for our women human rights defenders taking place across the globe in multiple country and conflict settings. And this work being presented today is a sampling of the work that women human rights defenders work on. It is also important to recognize that this work is often accomplished and achieved via unpaid labor and genuine commitment. The Women, Peace and Security Network, for example, and all you see coming out of it is mostly volunteer run. This is demonstrative of the depth of our commitments. I will also be remiss in not speaking to the censorship of this event and what it experienced. As many of you know, this event was to be held in person on Parliament Hill in efforts to offer an opportunity for education, dialogue, and discussion with elected officials in Canada. Late last week, the event was abruptly canceled without, I would argue, our agreement. It is a testament of our troubling times and what I would argue as our fragile democracy. As the majority of elected officials in Canada continue to ignore requests for meetings from constituents, gaslight those who they do speak to, and fail to even acknowledge as hundreds of thousands of Canadians of all creeds, faiths, races, and ages are marching in our cities, simply to have their right for their voices be represented amongst leadership, we are hyper aware of the fact that the Hill felt at risk having us in a room where we could potentially have direct conversations. I believe the opportunism practiced by many of them is not lost on us, and I will confidently say that our movement is not for sale. It is not available to be used as a political tool when convenient or to be tokenized. So the leaders who remain silent on a live genocide can pat themselves on their backs when egos need boosting. As a brave sister present on this call said to me late last week, they are trying to prevent us from gathering and they are trying to silence us, and we will not be silenced, we will only be louder. Human life literally depends on it, and this is the commitment which fuels our work. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our expert panel today that I am honored, humbled, and privileged to sit beside. From Syria, I have Noura Aljizawi. She is a senior researcher at the Citizen Lab at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Her work takes an in-depth look at human rights issues connected to disinformation, digital authoritarianism, and digital transnational repression. Originally from Homs, Syria, she was a prominent figure in the Syrian uprising. She played a key role in the peaceful movement and has written and spoken publicly about her experience of abduction, detention, and torture. Ultimately, she was forced to flee Turkey, where she became the vice president of the National Coalition for Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces. She was elected to a role on the organization's Geneva negotiation panel and participated in the peace talks in 2014. While still in Turkey, she founded an organization called Start Point, an NGO dedicated to human rights and psychosocial support for Syrian women and girls who have been detained and tortured. Much of the work is done in Syria. She subsequently moved to Canada and completed her master's degree in global affairs from the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. Noura has extensive experience with civic and social organizations and focuses on political strategy, business development, global affairs, human rights, and gender issues. We also have Shabnam Salehi, who is a visiting lecturer and researcher at the University of Ottawa. She is a scholar and a prominent women's rights activist from Afghanistan. She started her academic journey in 2012 when she became an assistant professor at Kabul University. Since then, she has lectured on public policy with concentrations in human rights, gender equality, and women empowerment. In addition to this, she has taught policy, research, and leadership courses at numerous private higher education institutions. She served as a senior researcher at several local research institutions and think tanks on issues related to women's rights and gender-based policy forums. Shabnam also served as a commissioner and head of the Women's Rights Promotion and Protection Unit in the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission from 2019 until 2021. She contributed to restructuring the WPU and strengthening its potential. Under her leadership, the WPU designed and implemented interventions that contributed to the protection and promotion of women's rights. Shabnam advocated for women's participation in private and public institutions and helped strengthen women's decision-making training. She advocated and contributed to reform laws affecting marriage, virginity tests, divorce, transgender rights, and sexual harassment. She also engaged in government policy reforms on violence against women, female prisoners, and victims. Shabnam is continuing her advocacy work for women's rights in Afghanistan from abroad. She is based in Ottawa by supporting monitoring and evaluation efforts. And we have Ketty Nivyabandi, the Secretary General of Amnesty International Canada's English-speaking chapter. Ketty has served as the SG for Amnesty International Canada's English-speaking section. She oversees the domestic and international human rights mandate of Amnesty International Canada and acts as its lead representative. A global human rights activist and advocate, Ketty holds in-depth expertise and lived experience in forced displacement, human rights defenders at risk, civic space and conflict, and political transitions, and the global intersections of gender, race, and human rights. Prior to seeking asylum in Canada in 2015, she braved police violence as the lead organizer of women's peaceful protests for democratic change in her country, Burundi. In her previous roles, she has led research, advocacy, and communication strategies with women peace activists in several conflict and post-conflict settings and countries, including Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, Myanmar, Uganda, and Guatemala. Her work is rooted in people power, public accountability, and a feminist decolonial approach to human rights. Ketty studied international relations, is a former journalist, and published poet. She also lives in Ottawa with her 2 teenage daughters. Finally, unfortunately, we did have a last-minute cancellation from our speaker from Yemen, Rasha Jarham, who is also a member of the Women, Peace and Security Network. I encourage you to check out her organization, the Peace Track Initiative's work. And with that, I'll start with my first question. So this is to all the panelists. I guess the first question would be hearing a little bit from you on what it really means to you when you are referenced as a women human rights defender. Can you speak a little bit about your own work and how this connects to the term as well as the Declaration on Human Rights? And I'll start with Noura.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the great warm introduction and for all efforts you all guys to put together to bring us here tonight. And thanks for the participants who joined us online and challenge with us all the barriers to be together tonight. I will be very honest and straightforward about my experience as a human rights defender. I grew up in Syria. Syria, I always describe it before 2011 as a black box, where we were living under extensive censorship and surveillance. It means that we didn't have access to the world independently. Everything was filtered, and we were forced to see the world through the eyes and the lens of those in power, through the lens of the regime. So the International Human Rights Declaration and the concept of human rights and all of those amazing concepts that inspired us later on when we started knowing about them were unknown things for us. We didn't have access. We didn't have the rights to access to information independently. However, I started, I believe, very early in my life to say something about a human's life in our country, asking questions at the age of 15 and 16 about the missing individuals, about why we can't speak, about why vulnerable people don't have rights, why we can't help them, why those in power are not doing all of those. And yeah, to be honest, my parents hated me because they always fear the consequences of my curious mind and my bold questions. I remember like we grew up with this slogan that walls have ears, and literally walls have ears. My dad was, I was speaking at school, and the day after, my dad was called on, and in school, the principal invited also one of the security officials to interrogate my dad about the family's thoughts and political views. So I got my family in trouble, and I got myself in trouble proudly, very early of my life. And then when I started making my way through, when I started the university at the age of 17, I started learning more, meeting some people, and I started getting access to the internet. So the first time I read about the International Human Rights Declaration, I was like, wow, it has a name. And what I was believing on and thinking about all of those years is something that the humanities and brilliant minds also thought about it. So I'm not the only intelligent person in this world. I feel like very proud and very connected. So then I started reading more about like getting more access, trying to circumvent the censorship and surveillance on the internet that the government imposed early on, and reading the reports on the human rights violations in Syria and knowing more about the world. It was really like a great moment for me. But what I believed that, and still believe in, being a human rights defender is just as normal as being a human, standing and speaking up for those who are vulnerable, defending the rights of everyone to make the world safe, just, equitable for them, for those who are vulnerable. This is how we distinguish ourselves as a human from being animals in the farm. So this is my journey shortly, and I will turn it over to my other colleagues to speak, and would love to talk more about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Noura. I think that even just from that, we have a lot to unpack, so we will delve into it. Before then, I'll head over to Shabnam to talk a little bit about your work, what you do, and how you connect the title of Women Human Rights Defender with your work and the declaration itself.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation. So being referenced as a human rights defender, I think for me, it's acknowledgement of both of action and identity. For me, it's show the dedication to fight for the not only for your rights but for the rights of others, and also the term shows for me the resilience of women who actively advocate for rights of the other people. So we know that fighting, promoting, advocating, in society, in every society is difficult, but especially for a part, it's very difficult for the parts of both that we have come from. I was born and raised in the society. We are the society which is mainly men-dominant. I am the eldest sister in the family, and I have 4 other sisters. So my journey starts from my family. We know that I don't know how much you know, but mainly in male-dominated societies, family legacies somehow carried by male. So since I don't have a brother at the time, so my family forced my father to get married for a second time, just for the case of having a boy. So I think my journey starts from there, fighting within the family, then coming to society. Then when I was 7, I deprived from the right of education when in 1996 Taliban came and they took the power. So at that time, I start somehow advocating in the society. the feeling of deprivation just because of gender, it's difficult for someone, but I face it. And at that time, I decided to become a women's rights activist. After that, after 2001 or 9/11, when the situation get better in Afghanistan, and I restart my journey, educational journey, and I choose to be a lawyer, and I choose to be a women's rights defender, because that's not something that is that comes for me as a incident, or that's something that I didn't choose, but I choose from the childhood. I choose it as a discipline. I choose as a career. So in the law faculty, I became more familiar with the legal terms, with the human rights, Universal Declaration, with the other principle. So from the academic journey, or from the early academic journey, I was familiar with the Human Rights Declaration, with the all international law. So I try to write every paper on human rights, especially women's rights. I try to participate in every event that's about human rights. And I write my thesis also on the women's rights. After that, when I start my career, I was a professor, but beside that, I tried to do research. My research was mainly focused on the policy change, policy reform, legal analysis, and also especially the feminist legal analysis of the laws. And I try to advocate to bring the changes in laws. And after that, when I start my journey as a commissioner at the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission, I choose to be a women's rights commissioner. And after that, I try to bring the changes that one time I done research on it. And fortunately, I succeed in bringing few changes in the law, but 2021 somehow it is everything that we have done for almost 2 decades. So even right now, when I am a researcher, I'm a PhD student. I'm doing my PhD on the human rights. I'm documenting, even though now I'm not able to work on field, but I'm documenting women's rights violation that's happening right now. I'm writing on the women's rights, especially the gender-based violence or gender apartheid that's happening right now in Afghanistan. And I'm totally connected to the human rights and my journey that I have started almost 15 years back. So a human rights declaration is something, for me, it's a set of the principles that somehow shape my journey, that shape my identity as a human rights defender. So that's something of that's part of my life that I can't ignore anytime. Thank you. I will.
Thank you. I think that resonates with a lot of the panel, that it really is revealing to read that document. I can tell you that I have my education in human rights too, and it's a place where it just feels like home when you know that you have the tools and you know that you have the entitlement to be treated a certain way. Thank you for that. I'll move on to Ketty. So again, how are you feeling being labeled as a women human rights defender? Can you tell us a little bit about the work you have accomplished and completed, and your thoughts on the declaration itself?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much for this event, and it's so wonderful to be gathered together on this occasion. I think for me, the label of women human rights defender, came to me much later in life and quite accidentally. And although then I realized that a lot of my life and also the people around me had actually been women human rights defenders, they just simply did not have the terminology. And so I come from a line of very strong women, my mother, my grandmother, who faced very challenging political times in our country and who took up space and who upheld the rights not just of themselves but their communities, and who also modeled very much for me what it's like to be a woman using her voice for others. And so I think we think of the term in a much more modern way, but it's important to acknowledge that we've had women human rights defenders for centuries and millennia across cultures around the world. We've had women pushing, urging, leading for change, leading for human rights, even before we had the terminology of human rights. And so when I think of the Declaration, which is a remarkable document that outlined for the first time the basic principles of what it should be like to be human and how the world should operate, it's a miraculous document, as someone has said. At the same time, I'm cognizant that everything that is in that document, and the reason why it resonates so powerfully for me, is that those are the very teachings of my own culture, that, you know, that's exactly what ubuntu means in many African countries. It is to treat the other individual as you would treat yourself, to afford a wide range of rights and privileges as you would afford them for yourself. And so as much as we celebrate and we mark this incredible document, it's important, I think, for us to remember that these values were always existing throughout our societies around the world. Some of the earlier versions of the Human Rights Declaration can be found almost everywhere in Western Africa. You go back to the 12th century to find the Manding Charter, which very much outlines the same principles as the Declaration. So, you know, back to how I found myself in this line of work, less like what Shabnam was sharing. I didn't choose this path, it chose me, and I constantly found myself doing what is the equivalent of being a woman human rights defender, until I finally surrendered to it, and I'm now officially working on human rights. But it's been a trajectory that has sort of pulled me throughout my life, and I'm just simply answering that call.
Thank you. I think the part that really stood out to me with everyone is just our roles in our families as well, and how either we ended up in positions where this is the work we just had to do or we're driven towards. I am curious. So I heard from Shabnam that she's an eldest daughter. I am myself as well. What about the rest of everyone? Yeah, it is such a thing, especially in a variety of our cultures, right? So I know that I used to have bosses in previous work that would be like, you're the eldest, aren't you? And it comes with the territory, I guess, where we need to take care of everyone. I feel like it's just so innate. I want to throw another question out to the panel. What would you say are some of the biggest challenges that you face in realizing your work and your cause? And I know that many of you have faced very risky situations that oftentimes are really difficult to understand when you're in the context of North America, for example. What would you say some of those risks have been to you personally, professionally, with family? Can you delve a little bit more deep into, you know, basically teaching us a little bit about what it really takes in certain contexts to do what you do, and how you balance these and stay motivated in your work? So I'll start with Shabnam, and then I'll head to Ketty, and I'll do Noura next.
Oh, yeah. I think working for human rights itself somehow equal to accepting risks and challenges, because it is somehow related to or somehow connected to the challenges. Coming to my scenario, so there were different kind of the challenges that I have faced during my stay back in Afghanistan and even in exile. So first, I think security challenges is the biggest one. I'm someone that I'm not afraid of myself, but mainly I afraid because of my family. So the security challenges or security threats that I have received, it's the biggest part of my work. I receive more than 30 death threats. I was someone who were very vocal in the social media. And in 2020, when I was a part of the group who monitored peace talk in Doha, when the peace talk was happening between the Taliban and Afghanistan government. So I have a very hard talk face-to-face with the Taliban, and after that I receive a few calls that you are a spy, you are trying to bring the Western agenda to Afghanistan, you are trying to bring this kind of the phenomena that's somehow considered as anti-culture or anti-religious. And once they bombed my car in 2020, at the end of the 2020, that's one part, that's security challenges. Beside the security challenges, I think there's a biggest part of working as a human rights defender is social challenges. Social challenges, because it's very difficult to bring social changes overnight. You have to work on it, especially at the domestic violence or the gender-based violence. Mostly gender-based violence is somehow rooted at our social behavior, and changing social behavior is very difficult. And it's a term that when you have our rights, no one wants to lose the rights. And when you are fighting for women's rights, and men somehow consider you as a anti-male or somehow, so they try to make challenges or barriers in front of you to not bringing changes in society. So I face that much, because when we try to bring amendment in law, or even when we try to make a new policy, even at the government level, especially male colleagues, they try to somehow treat as, or somehow scare us that your action is somehow anti-culture, anti-social, and that will have consequences for you. Besides the social and security challenges, I think advocacy itself is somehow challenged, because it's long-term process. It's not short-term process. In most of cases, when you are trying for years and change didn't happen, somehow it's bring dissatisfaction for you, that you are trying a lot but nothing change in society. So that's somehow sometime I feel that it's enough, because change is not coming and you should stop there. But somehow we succeed to overcome the challenge. So I think in my case, security, social, and somehow the self personal barriers, and that was the main case in my case. But after coming to the exile, I think I faced a different kind of challenges, especially when you are a human rights defenders in home and you come to exile, and people consider you as someone who flew the country, someone who didn't stand with the victims. So you lost your legitimacy. I think right now didn't have access to the field, didn't have a power to change the thing, and losing your legitimacy as biggest challenges that I have faced in my career. So
thank you. I've heard that many times with the defenders that I work with. There's a self-guilt in being safe, and then there's also the sentiment that does get passed on where you're considered a traitor. And I think that's a really big thing to unpack as well, and part of the work for sure. Thank you. Ketty, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges you faced and the risks you faced, and how you do maintain your momentum and motivation?
Yes, I think I really like how Shabnam outlined it. So there's a physical part which we all know about. So I faced harassment, death threats, including threats to my children, which is, I think, an aspect that is, unique and needs to be discussed more. Often we feel invincible when it's just us, but when it is our family members, our loved ones who are targeted, then that's often when we come undone, right? So that was very challenging, physical threats as well. And then the loss, so becoming a refugee, exile, having to, losing your environment. That's the very physical part, and the social economic challenges that come with those hard choices that you have made as well. And the social isolation that comes with time as well. I think in my case, I saw a shift between great momentum, because there was political momentum at some time, and great support, to that support dwindling as the political landscape shifts. And I find that women human rights defenders, on the contrary to men human rights defenders, who are often seen as heroes wherever they go, as celebrated, and even when they are in exile, they go on tour, and you've got families supporting them and helping them, and they're really acclaimed. For women, it quickly comes with the label of troublemaker. And so it's very easy for you then to become socially isolated in your own community as well, which is a difficult challenge to overcome. But on the more intimate part, and the emotional part, I think this is where again we need to create more awareness on the risks and the damages. And one of the risks is really how do you protect your heart? How do you stay whole in the midst of these often enormous battles, which are not moving fast enough? You're not seeing these results. You're facing all these attacks. How do you not become embittered by these, how do you find the balance between being a warrior, a peaceful warrior, and also staying whole and being the individual that that your loved ones need you to be, but that you also need to be? And I find that challenge, one where I think we always have to be careful and be mindful to not let the struggle change us, but instead to remain as purposeful and as as whole as we can. And so that's a constant balance. I don't think I cannot claim to have found it, but it is something that I'm particularly mindful of. And the last aspect that's related to your emotional well-being that I'd like to bring up is the online violence, the digital violence, especially for women human rights defenders who are active, particularly in social media spaces. The type of violence that you face, the types of attacks and harassment, and the toll that they take on you. You may, aim to preserve yourself as much as you can, but these actually have an impact. And these are some of the challenges, again, that we need to collectively find solutions to.
Thank you for that. I think framing it with those different aspects is so important, because even here, while we're doing the work that we do, there's so many elements and layers to all of what you just said, including just the pressure to keep that face on. I think all of us have a face that we have to keep on, and this impression that we always just have to stay strong and not break down or not have those emotions. And I think that is a very big piece that we do discuss amongst ourselves, right? We do say, take a break, hide out for a bit, be human, you're allowed, and then do it. Like, I get it too, where you still have to be available for your family. And how do you balance that? And I don't, like you're saying, Ketty, like I don't know what the answer to that is. Maybe if Noura can enlighten us, we do continue to share and discuss. And I think that's also why it's so important for us to gather and get to know each other, so that we are able to be that support system for each other. And I hope that we can accomplish some of that today, where we initiate those connections that didn't exist before. Thank you. Noura, can you tell us a little bit I mean, I'm sure I'm very aware, but you know, some of the risks that you faced personally, professionally, and moving above and beyond that as well, how you would define that resilience and where you do find that strength.
Yeah, I really share a lot of emotions and troubles that Shabnam and Ketty faced, and it's really heartwarming but also heartbreaking how these challenges and risks are not only specific to or specified in specific country or context, but unfortunately they are global, similar to our movement and our activism. Personally, I started facing the troubles. I don't know, in my opening remarks, I just started talking about the troubles, but yeah, for sure, in the first place is for me was the security risk that I face from the authoritarian regime in Syria. It ended up with me for me being arrested a couple of times. The first time I was detained I was detained twice from the campus. The first time I was 17. It involved the attempts of one of the security guards on campus to harass me sexually, and a number of times. And then when I reacted, they used that as an excuse to arrest me and torture me. So I experienced torture very early in my life, and I remember how harmful I was when I was released after around 10 days, and I found myself socially isolated. Even my dear friends on campus who were eyewitnesses, who were supposed to be eyewitnesses to support me if we have a justice system, they were just turning their faces, leaving me behind. For a year, I used to go to the university every day, attending my classes, but no one was talking to me. It was full year of isolation until, unfortunately, not women, but men. I absolutely understand the vulnerability of women in these cases, but also some of my male colleagues broke that silence and started socializing with me. That was my first memory. And then the second time I was arrested while attending one of my classes. I was in the classroom, and the security forces came to the classroom and arrested me. It was just because I was blogging, and in my blogs I was criticizing the human rights violations and writing some fiction. It was not something even now when I read what I wrote back then, it's a joke, it's nothing. But even this very light level of criticism, they didn't tolerate with that. And I ended up also in detention for about 2 weeks or 10 days, I can't remember. So every time I would be threatened also by my family that if you will continue these kinds of trouble, we will never allow you to go again to university. So always my academic education, although I was one of the top of my classmates, but as a girl in that society, my academic education was always under threat because of the social norms and because of the fear, which is combination between the systematic gender-based violence from state and also how these kinds of violence sponsored by state or state-backed violence could trigger the social norms and could turn the community and the whole society against the woman facing all of these repression. And yeah, eventually I ended up in a longer detention discourse in 2012 upon my involvement in the peaceful movement in Syria. And yeah, the toll of torture and emotional, psychological, and physical torture was a thing. But what broke me inside is when I was released and I found that the 2 master's programs that I was pursuing, I was no longer a student because the security forces decided to fire me and to erase all of my academic records from the university. So I couldn't continue, and they confiscated my thesis. I wrote 2 master theses, but I didn't have the credentials. And even like I always like recall all of the intellectual work I left behind. Even like financially, I was broke because I was fired from my work. And as a family, we became under this collective punishment. My father was arrested. My minor brother and minor sister were arrested. My whole family was forcibly displaced from our home. And when I was released, I just found like the world was like just turned upside down for me. And the guilt of survival, because I left behind kids, I left behind elderly women, I left behind all of these amazing people. And even like I hated myself why I was known, why the world advocated for me, whereas left everybody else. And until now, I don't have the enough energy to even read the statements that the world leaders and international human rights organizations issued calling on my for my release. I always feel guilty about that, and I always hate myself because I know how advocacy saved me, but I feel the rage and guilt that advocacy was only for one person. It helped and saved that person, but it failed the others. So yeah, the moment that when I was forced to leave my country, it was really rough decision because working from exile was not something that I was trained to do. I'm always like a community person, grassroots organizer and mobilizer. So I feel like I'm really in trouble when I found myself in Turkey and just started thinking how I need to resume my work and to be active again. And then I decided that I will change I will translate all of my repression, all of my depression, and anger and rage into movements. So this is how we grow. This is how we get stronger. So I worked together with other colleagues and we founded Start Point to be able to work with women and defenders on the ground, in particular women rights defenders. But it's not easy and it would be always difficult. However, in exile, similar to many women rights defenders in exile, maybe in the beginning I was naive to think that exile means a relative degree of safety. Unfortunately, it ended up that it's not. Like it's the opposite. In exile, you don't know exactly where the risk is coming from. Is it from the host state's authorities? Is it from government agents? Is it from government allies? I faced a lot of troubles, including the how my human rights work was not satisfying any party in the conflict in Syria. So a lot of armed groups and radical groups used to send me death threats. Even like a couple of times, a knife was put on my neck, and I was threatened to be murdered in the street. And yeah, definitely all of that would leave you socially isolated because, unfortunately, if a man was facing all of these threats, he would be surrounded by the support, the solidarity. But because of my gender, I was just like being left alone to handle all of this. And yeah, definitely the attacks on social media and all of this digital repression, even the hacking. I was targeted a couple of times digitally also by different state actors, including the Iranian regime, the Russian, and the Syrian regime itself. And like all of these kinds of repression would leave you one more time alone because people would dare to message you privately and say, "Oh, sorry for what you're going through, but we don't want to be to associate with you online because we don't want to be targeted ourselves. And you say like, okay, you can't say the nice things publicly. Why you're saying this privately? I don't care. But yeah, this is unfortunately the painful reality. And one of the risks that I faced was the Interpol. There was a special notice sent by the Russian state to one of the European states while I was traveling from Turkey on a business trip. And I was arrested at the airport in Europe and kept for a couple of hours, for around 8 hours, because of that special notice that was not published on the website of the Interpol, but also like it was sent privately. Yeah, unfortunately, all of my troubles here in Canada through the immigration system and all of this, everything was being pulled against me. You feel like someone was framing me in somehow, and I feel like, okay, is it someone now? I feel like all of these triggers are bringing the memories of Syria, and I feel like in somehow the language is being used was in somehow reflecting the language of the Syrian regime authorities and security forces in framing someone. And one more time, the human rights work I did, the peacemaking work I did, was being criminalized in a country that was where I was assuming that it's going to be safer, or at least a bit safer. But unfortunately, I ended up to the conclusion, not only through my experience, but also through my experience as a researcher at the Citizen Lab studying transnational repression and digital transnational repression, through the experiences of all of those defenders and women rights defenders, that there's nowhere we can feel safe. And regardless where we are, the risk is gonna go after us everywhere. However, all of those losses, I don't count them as great deals, because one door would open, but one door would close, but many doors would be open. And belonging, the sense of belonging, the sense of being supported, surrounded with the love and support and solidarity. Solidarity is our only weapon. So feeling supported, feeling that I have all of these incredible women around me, I have all of these people who are defending human rights, despite that they know the very heavy and the very high price they pay. I feel belong, I feel loved, I feel supported, and I don't regret anything that I've been through. I feel always stronger. The resilience is always, for me, come from those people, from beautiful women like you guys. And the other questions, I don't know how to answer, how to keep the balance on daily basis between my frustration, between this sense of depression when we fail sometimes, but just being connected and being surrounded with beautiful women and brave defenders, like many of people in our panel. And the participants, I feel like, yeah, I feel stronger, and I feel like I can keep fighting forever.
I think that's a really important piece. Thank you so much. I had a colleague in Iraq earlier this year tell me that, if you haven't faced a death threat yet, then you're not doing the work to its full extent. And basically what I translated that to was, when we do face those death threats and receive them, then it is an indicator that we're doing something that is working, something, that if our voices are those threats, then it really is an indicator of the impact that we're having. And I guess just based on that too, and I'll throw this out to the whole panel, what do you believe? I guess before that, I'll start with, how has your work been impacted? And I know, Noura, you spoke to this a little bit, so I'll throw it to Shabnam and Ketty. How has your work been impacted in exile? Your motivations towards it and your approaches? And what does keep you motivated? After hearing like, I'm sure we didn't hear everything that everyone has been through, but having an understanding of what is at risk when we do the work that we do, what keeps you going? So I'll ask Shabnam.
Thank you. I think earlier I touched a little bit about for someone who is working on a community, who is working for social change, being in exile is a kind of the punishment. You don't have a audience, you can't change anything for your community member, but still you somehow claim that you are a human rights defender. Losing the legitimacy, it's a big problem. Every day, everyone claims that you escape from challenges, you escape from the problems. So you don't have any right to claim yourself as a human rights defender. If you are a human rights defender, you should stand up in the between of the problem, and you should help your colleagues or victims. So that's the one part of the problem that we already faced. The other part of the problem, especially for human rights defenders, since we are engaged with the documentation. When you don't have access to the field, you can talk to your victim directly, especially nowadays in Afghanistan. If Taliban find my phone number with anyone, they will definitely prosecute them, because they know that we are documenting, and they know that there is something, a process of justice or transitional justice is coming, and they are trying to hide their crime. So you don't have access to your victims. Plus, in my situation, in a country that we don't have a rule of law, we don't have any law, we don't have a legal system, we don't have a judiciary, and we have a gender apartheid system. The Taliban have a restriction on every part of the women's rights, and they somehow, the women are not allowed to go to school, to work. So in such kind of situations, it's very difficult to work from exile, from a very far from other part of the world. But still, since women don't have a voice in Afghanistan, we, the people, are living outside of Afghanistan. We try to become a voice for them. So I think that the only source, the encouragement source for me is that when I see the situation of women in Afghanistan and see that they don't have any voice, I try to become a voice for them. That's something that keep me alive and keep me encouraged to try my level best. Especially every morning when I wake up, I receive a bunch of messages from the victims, from the human rights defender, from the different part of society, that they are facing persecution, they are facing different kinds. Is there any hope? Can you change, or can you try? Can you at least somehow make our voice? So I think that's one part that somehow make me encouraged. Beside that, when I don't consider human rights defender as a career, but it is passion. Whenever, if you try to leave this part, you are not able. That's part of your life. That's part of yourself. So you can't escape from that. It's carry with you. So when you are a human rights defender, you can't escape from yourself, because that's your part of yourself. So that's the other source of encouragement for myself. And the third part, when we see the work of other human rights defenders in exile, and see their example that they are set before us, so that's I think that's another part of encouragement, so that we somehow keep me alive, that when they achieve at least something, we can do it. And nowadays, you know that we run a very big advocacy for codification and recognition and criminalizing of the gender apartheid. So we have a lot of voices all over the world with us. So I think that's the three source of encouragement for myself. And no doubt, the mind work is somehow impacted a lot, because before, when I used to live in Afghanistan, I have authority. I can change a lot of things. I can somehow deliver services to the victim directly, but now I'm unable to do so.
It's
but
different.
Still, there's a hope.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing I noticed as well in my work with human rights defenders, is the fact that there's a need to pivot. And I think that's also a big piece in recognition of how we do our work in human rights, is we look at the tools that are available, and then we look at what we need to do and how we're going to do it best and where we are that day, even sometimes, right? Because the context can be so different and changing. Ketty, I'll ask you the same questions, but I'll also add, are you able to tell us a little bit about what you see in the position that you sit in at Amnesty, on what the challenges are that women human rights defenders face, and what kinds of supports are even needed, and the risks that you definitely see in the work that you do?
Yes, so to answer maybe the first question, I relate so much. It's so incredible how everybody's story sort of mirrors another. When I arrived in Canada, I had at the time co-founded an organization on women, peace and security. I was very, very active, and I genuinely thought that this would be a matter of weeks and months, and I would be going back. And I found myself leaving for the first 2 years, nearly 3 years. I lived literally on a Burundian time zone. So I would be up at night, sending messages, writing letters, editing, going back and forth, checking, WhatsApp messages and looking at the latest casualties. And I was living back home rather than living here in Canada. And it took me about 2.5 years to realize that this was not a sustainable model, that I was going to crash, that emotionally it would not be feasible, and that I needed that this exile thing was going to be longer than I had expected. And I had to, come to terms with that and raise my children as well. And so I made a very difficult, very challenging, hard, but important decision to actually exit a number of, activities that I was involved in, and to, first of all, to self-preserve myself, and to be able to focus my energy on building a new life, needed to find work, needed to find things to do. And so I sort of took that passion, that energy, that dedication, and put it into, now unable to work on my home country, I've decided to put it into upholding the rights of women elsewhere in the world, and human rights globally. That is what motivates me. But I don't want to undermine and not emphasize the loss that comes with that. And that, I think, is something that everybody who's living through that experiences. It's a hard choice to make. And just because you're working on something else does not mean that your mind, your heart is also in everything else that you care about. So I pour my energy into enabling human rights to be upheld globally. And part of what we do at Amnesty, we're not a service organization, we're not a humanitarian organization, but we advocate for particularly women human rights defenders' rights to be upheld, but also to be protected. And we also advocate for practical solutions. It's very clear that we still have a long way to go, not just in Canada, but globally, in understanding the threats and the risks that are faced by women human rights defenders because of their gender and their identity, and that are different from what male human rights defenders face. And so there's a lot of work that we're trying to do to really underscore that. We've talked about many of these risks, criminalization, harassment and intimidation, violence, which men face as well, but things like social isolation, smear campaigns, we haven't talked about those, and defamation, which also has a huge impact on how you are able to function within your community. Burnout and mental health, profound mental health issues. We spoke bravely here about depression and burnout and anxiety and all these things that plague women human rights defenders, particularly because of their unique identity. And here it's important for us to remember 2 women human rights defenders who have lost their lives in Canada. The Egyptian Sarah Hegazi, who passed away, took her life in June 2020, and Karima Balok, who later that year also was found dead 4 years after she was granted asylum in Canada. These things tend to be taken too much as anecdotes, rather than piecing together the various threads that we have heard today. So there's a need to provide practical support. And some of the things that we try to push for are things like expediting and facilitating the approval of asylum applications, temporary relocations, protected status, and back to the situation that Noura was speaking about, to ensure that women human rights defenders are protected in the country that they're in. They don't have to worry constantly about their own safety and security, but also making very flexible and rapid funding available for protecting some of these women human rights defenders in emergency cases. Those you have heard from today were fortunate enough to make it to Canada, but let's hold space for all the women human rights defenders who have not made it to safe havens, and those who are still trapped in extremely dangerous situations, who are trying to leave and are finding it extremely difficult to do so because there are no mechanisms in place. There are very few to support them. And then we need to also take strong measures to protect and ensure physical security, but also digital security. And doing that always in consultation with women human rights defenders. So the practical solutions that we need to find can only be found in collaboration, in consultation, and with women human rights defenders, and having them lead that work. So that's part of what we are and will always be engaged in, absolutely, to try and move the needle. And I think this conversation is also, part of that, raising awareness and building a community to advocate for this beyond the impacted women.
Thank you. I said this in advertising for the event, and I've been saying it for a majority of my career, where I find that a lot of the women I work with are some of the fiercest and resilient women I've ever met. And I always look at people and go, what did you go through to be like that? And it's very enlightening to hear these experiences and these perspectives, because you're right. It is taken for granted sometimes. People don't understand, and none of you have ended up in the positions you have because you just walked up into these positions, right? And it's really important to recognize that, because that is part of what fuels the energy and the work. I wanted to ask, and I did say that I would, given the situation that is currently taking place around the world in terms of people not feeling protected in a variety of scenarios, and even just looking at the context of Canada today, and you yourself and where you're placed in the work that you're doing here in Canada, would you say that you currently feel safe? And I'll throw it out to anyone who wants to answer that, because I think it's important for the audience to hear that. That is why I'm asking the question.
May I?
Yes, please.
So I think when it comes to safety, I think it has a different definition of safety. If it comes to the physical safety, maybe most of us say that yes, physically it is safe, especially for me. But when it comes to the psychological safety, when it comes to the digital safety, I think most of us face threats, especially when you have a trauma, when you face the persecution, when you made to flee your country, and every day you build upon this trauma because you are in connection with the victims, and every day they tell you the sad stories, and you should listen to them, and you every day you build up, and that's a very huge psychological burden on everybody. And at the same time, you are trying to show yourself as strong as you can, because if you somehow feel weak, then you will not be able to help others. So I think psychologically, most of the as a human rights defender, they didn't feel safe, especially when, and also digitally, especially when you receive a lot of threats to your social media account, when you someone try to hack your email addresses, and even they try to track your family member back home or even in exile. So that's how it put a lot of pressure on the human rights defenders. In most cases, I saw a lot of human rights defenders, they somehow stopped just because of safety of their family member. And nowadays, most of the human rights defenders in Afghanistan who have a family in Afghanistan, most of their family members are somehow blackmailed, and they themselves are blackmailed to not speak against the regime. So I think when it comes to the psychological or the digital safety, it's very difficult to say that we are feeling safe.
Thank you. Noura, are you able to tell us a little bit about your impressions, because this is what you work with, on the repression piece? So what the transnational repression looks like to you when your standpoint is here from Canada, on the surveillance piece, and also what you're seeing today here and how you would see it resonating in terms of the patterns in other places.
Yeah, unfortunately, my personal experience and also my research into the experiences of more than 100 defenders, like the vast majority of them are women human rights defenders that I worked with through my research on digital transnational repression. The painful reality that we cannot separate digital safety from physical safety, and in many cases, whether in exile or domestically, digital repression and digital surveillance, one of its consequences is the physical harm. So for me as Noura, definitely I don't feel safe, not in Canada, not in anywhere in the world. And it's really painful when I feel my personal safety is something that I have to take care of on my own. Every step should be calculated, sadly, and everything could sometimes constitute a risk, including thinking about traveling to visit a family somewhere, or speaking to some people here who are supposed to understand. I remember when I was intimidated by a lady who was working at the office of my former MP, and she said, if you didn't do anything wrong in Syria, you wouldn't be imprisoned, and you constitute a security risk to this country. And like, wow, I'm amazed. I'm really amazed. And I was really feeling threatened. And then I asked her not to call me anymore. I told her, like, if you call me, I will report you to the police, because this is harassment, and I will never tolerate this harassment. However, this is just one incident, but the experiences of people I interviewed to our first case study on the experiences of defenders in exile in Canada. In their experiences trying to seek help from the officials, from the elected officials, from the law enforcement here, and the lack of understanding of the risk, the lack of understanding of the complexity of the context and the complexity and the absence of addressing the intersectionality is in the first place a huge issue. But when you see that someone would report to the police and the police barely know what exactly is going on. Ketty mentioned Karima. Karima for years was being treated badly by the law enforcement here and was questioned a couple of times and was treated as a criminal just because of her human rights activism. And even the way that the police concluded the investigation into her suicide or death, no one knows, is really leaving many individuals, many defenders here depressed, fear, threatened, because they don't know if they would be supported and assisted by the law enforcement and by the government officials. Just remembering that people usually talk about transnational repression and refer to the murder of Khashoggi, but Khashoggi's associate, Omar Abdulaziz, was threatened digitally by Saudi Arabia while he was on the Canadian soil. He was even threatened physically. Saudi agents flew to Canada a couple of times to meet him and to threaten him and to lure him to go back to Saudi Arabia. But the Canadian authorities did nothing. And even like when it comes to global affairs, Canada didn't issue any statement to defend the rights of individuals on the Canadian soil. So people, I feel like, not only speaking about me as Noura, but speaking about the experiences of many people I worked with, they don't feel safe because they feel like they don't know anyone in the government, which is the responsibility of the government, of any government in the world, to protect people on its territory. It's not a favor that the officials are being asked to do. It's their responsibility. This is why governments exist in the first place. So the lack of support and the lack of understanding of the complexity and the risk that defenders are facing globally, not only in Canada, not only in their home country, is really something must be addressed. And the reality that digital threats could be translated into physical threats is also another issue, should be addressed and should be translated by the government officials into real actions, doxing, threats, defamation, disinformation, intimidation, all of those forms of online harassment that defenders are facing, and all of those campaigns are being backed by their state, their government of their country of origins, should be addressed, and the government here, along with liberal democracies elsewhere, should act accordingly to protect and to show authoritarian regimes that those actions are not tolerated, and everybody should be feeling safe, should be feeling supported, and should feel like they can at least get some sort of support if any risk occurs. But in the meantime, unfortunately, it's really dark. It's really depressing to see that there is a lack of response. And we know that in politics, silence is green light to act. Act is green light to authoritarian regimes to act.
Yeah, I thank you for sharing that. I think it's really important to understand that there isn't a distinct line between what happens digitally and then what does transpire, and these threats need to be taken seriously. I'm sure many of you have heard me say this as well, that it is a responsibility of leadership to acknowledge problems and to speak up when they're supposed to be speaking up, to set the example, to stop the violence. And here in Canada, you know, I completely personally blame my leadership in the rise of hate crimes that have been taking place in the last 2 months, because a red carpet has been laid out for it through the silence and through what has been said. And I mean, we've been exchanging quite a bit amongst ourselves in solidarity with the work amongst the participants that are here and beyond on recognizing that. So we will be sharing this session with elected leadership as well. And I know in our network, we have access to quite a bit. And the message is loud and clear that there is a responsibility for leadership to step up and protect. So I do have a question that we are planning on answering in the Q&A, but I am conscious of time. So I will let everyone have a last word. And my question to you in your last words is, what, I said my piece, but what is your recommendation that you would give, one, to the participants and the audience in terms of pursuing the work that they are doing, and on how they could support the work that you are doing and how we can support each other? So the support from the audience, and then as well as what would you recommend or would like to say to Canadian and or global leadership when you're talking about your work and your cause in human rights? And so I'll start with Ketty, and then Shabnam and Noura will end off.
I think the first step is really being aware and not taking these stories as, again, anecdotal stories, but really taking them as important information that adds up to a larger, much larger crisis that needs to be faced, and to add your voice to the calls that have been made and that will continue to be made. For Canadian officials in particular, we absolutely need a strategy and a way forward to support women human rights defenders, not only when they're abroad, but also when they make their way to Canada. This is, I think, long overdue and needs to be thought through in a range of ways. You've heard a range of risks that everybody faces here. Including through travel, for instance. This is one thing that I think Noura alluded to, but I know personally, whenever I travel, I am very unsafe. And so we need to ensure that we think about the well-being of women human rights defenders holistically, and that if we indeed want to lead on women human rights defenders, peace and security, human rights globally, let us put together the tools to support women human rights defenders adequately, and let that work be led by women human rights defenders themselves.
And it be informed properly. And I think this is a good step, because there is a lot that came out in this conversation, I think, that has practical component for sure. Thank you so much. Shabnam?
Yeah, I think being a voice is a more important thing for me. If I have an audience, if I have colleagues that can echo my voice or echo a voice of any human rights defender, I think that's the more important thing for me. So somehow complying the voice of the human rights defender, I think that's more important, both in domestic or international level, since we know now we are living on the global village, so your voice can make a difference. When it comes to the leadership, I think there's a two-part that I will ask the global or Canadian leadership that they can do. First, I think they should decrease the gap between their policies and their actions. We have a very fancy policies. We have a very fancy international law documents, international commitment, but when it comes to action, most of the board leadership somehow come short to somehow in application. So I think when we try to decrease the gap between the policies and action, that will definitely change the situation for human rights defenders. The secondly, I think they can use their leverage on the regimes or authoritative regimes. So when they have a leverage, when they have international commitment, I think they can use it. Thirdly, that I will somehow urge them that every country have their immigration system, but when it comes to human rights defenders, most of the country, they don't have a special quota for them. If you see the Canadian, that the number is very less. So when you don't use your leverage and you don't help the people in their countries, at least someone who is at risk, they can somehow offer them a safe haven for a time. So if they try to increase the number for the visas for human rights defenders and consider them as a one category of refugees, I think that will be a big help for the human rights defenders.
Thank you so much. We're hearing it loud and clear. I think it is very important to make sure that, that is understood that there are those practical components. Noura, I'll ask you to give your advice.
I can't add more. Ketty and Shabnam already covered everything. I just wanted to emphasize on the importance of elected officials to listen, to work closely with human rights defenders, and to build trust with the communities, because there's nothing about us without us. And if there's anything about us without us, it means that it's useless and it will never work. Human rights defenders, especially women rights defenders in this country, are brilliant, are visible, and it's not hard to find them. And they should be partners in designing and in planning for anything related to them and related also to the future of this country. In terms of our beautiful audience, I believe I read in the Q&A the question about how you can help. Definitely, our work, our struggle is a very long-term battle, and I believe our only weapon is solidarity and our collective work. So please keep it on, stay with us, and we always need to be connected. This is our only way to defeat the devil in this world and to make this world better for everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you.
No, and I just want to say thank you to everyone that offered their voices and also presented a lot of vulnerabilities. I think that takes a lot of strength. And I mean, I already expected to be strong, but we're also human, and it's a lot. So appreciate this. Know that we will follow up. For those that are online and are interested in more of the work that these defenders are working on, please do not feel any hesitation in messaging us to hear a little bit more, or receive links on the work. We can share that as well. Everyone has a lot of work that they're working on. And thank you everyone for taking the time on a weekday evening to be here with us. It means a lot, and it's not gone unnoticed. So with that, I will end off in appreciation and in solidarity. Thank you so much. Thank you.